Hey, what's up you guys? I'm Tatiana and this is My Tiny Zoo. In today's video, I'll be showing you, step by step, how I made my live planted bioactive vivarium for my blue tongue skink, Eponine. I hope you learn a lot and enjoy this video. Let's get right into it. So, before I could actually start this build or do anything with it, I needed a tank. This is a custom enclosure that was built for me for the purpose of being a home for my skink. It also has a small tank attached to it, which I will be using for a super secret animal in the near future. Once the tank frame was built out of 2x4s and plywood, I coated the entire inside with 4 coats of liquid rubber pond sealant. The subspecies of blue tongue skink that I have like their humidity to be kept between 70 and 80%, so I needed to make sure that my wood didn't mold or decompose over time. After the tank was finished, I could start my enclosure build. The first thing I needed to do was figure out my background. If you've seen my last videos, you'll know that I like to experiment with different themed enclosures, like the fantasy Lord of the Rings build I made for my leopard gecko. Wow! But for this skink build, I wanted it to be more natural and to replicate its native environment. After arranging the cork the way I liked it, I added some cups in spots that I knew I wanted to fill with plants later. Now it's time for the spray foam. I'm using regular insulation expanding foam for this build. The brand is Great Stuff, but I'm sure there are other brands depending on what country you're from. This expanding foam will give the background all of its texture and give it that 3D element that we're looking for. We are going to be carving most of this foam away on the next step, so if you do something a little bit too thick or in a way that you don't really like, don't worry too much about it. You will have a chance to fix it later. I didn't extend the background all the way to the bottom of this tank because I'm accounting for the drainage layer. Since I have some extra time on this time lapse, I figured I'd tell you guys a little bit more about Eponine. She's known as a K-Island blue tongue skink, and unlike the more popular northern blue tongues that come from Australia, she actually comes from an area called the Kai Islands, which are part of Indonesia. The climate that Indonesian skinks and all of their subspecies experience is much different than their Aussie cousins. So that is why pretty much all Indonesian subspecies need a much more tropical setup, meaning way more humidity than a normal northern blue tongue skink setup. The expanding foam is my favorite part of building enclosures. I mean, just listen to this. It's so satisfying. Like forbidden whipped cream. Anyways, after you've sprayed all of your foam and let it dry completely, you're ready to start carving. You have to carve your foam because the silicone we're using in the next step won't stick to the shiny, smooth texture of dry expanding foam. You can also use this as an opportunity to carve out any mistakes you made, or make your background thinner if you made it too thick the first time. Once you're done, you should have a nice pile of foam pieces to throw out. Now, I've heard some horror stories from other reptile keepers that said their expanding foam background eventually came loose or started to peel away from their tanks. I don't know if this is true or not, but it scared me, so before moving to the next step, I applied silicone along all the edges of the background and I let it dry completely. I've got to be completely honest with you guys, the next step on this build is the worst.
The worst! She is the worst person in the world. Huge skank, terrible.
What you need to do here is apply your silicone to the foam background and then use your hand or a foam brush to spread it into all of the cracks. After you spread it out, you can press the eco-earth or sand or mulch into the silicone and let it dry completely. I have 2 pieces of advice for this step. 1, be sure to do very small sections of silicone because if it starts to dry even a little bit, your substrate won't stick to it properly. And 2, make sure your substrate is completely dry. If your eco-earth is even a tiny bit damp, the silicone won't cure correctly and the eco-earth will just fall off. This step really sucks. It's my least favorite part about building tanks, so if you have a better solution or a better way to do this part, please let me know in the comments below, because this is really a pain. So here's what the build looks like after I finished all the sides. It took a few weeks, since I had to let the silicone dry each time, and flip the tank a few times to get all of the sides done. But overall, I like how it turned out. You can see I also built in a hide on the right side of the tank. This is just cork bark I attached with expanding foam, and then covered the foam the same way I did the background. Once this piece is all finished, it will be the hot hide as well as a basking spot for my skink. It's time to move on to the next step, the drainage layer. I'm filling the bottom of the tank with leca clay balls to help the water drain down. This helps with keeping a higher humidity, and it keeps the soil from becoming full of standing water. Like 8 bags of clay pebbles later, I added some plastic screening on top. This layer is meant to keep the soil and the cleanup crew out of the leca area. You want the screen to be a bit bigger than the bottom of your tank, so the edges fold up and keep the dirt in. Now we can move on to the fun part of filling our tank. I made my own substrate mix out of topsoil, eco-earth, mulch, and sphagnum moss. I'll put the ratios up on the screen for you. There's also a few handfuls of charcoal in there for the cleanup crew. The topsoil was purchased at a local hardware store. It's organic, so there isn't any pesticides or anything like that in it. But I did have to sift like 30 pounds of soil by hand to pull out any sharp rocks or sticks. I found a fair bit of glass as well, so be aware of that if you're mixing your own substrate. Another piece I added to this enclosure was a built-in tunnel for Eponine to use. Skinks are natural burrowers, so I wanted to give her something underground that will allow her to move through her home. It will also serve as a second entrance to her hot hide, because it's connected right here. After I filled the tank with a bit of substrate, I can start arranging my plants. Here you can see I'm planting a bird's nest fern and a Dracaena marginata, or a dragon tree. I love the texture of both of these plants, and they're both native to very tropical, humid environments, so I think they'll grow well here. I also took the time to add a hide for the cool side of the tank. Next, I added a golden pothos straight into the background. Pothos plants originated in Polynesia, but now you can find them in almost any tropical environment, including Indonesia, so it's perfect for this enclosure. Like I mentioned before, skinks love to burrow deep into the dirt, and because of this, they are notorious plant destroyers, because they dig up and trample the root systems. To try and prevent this, I planted my greenery into plastic pots, and buried the pot straight into the soil. I'll eventually have to switch the plants out when their root system becomes too cramped in their home, but it will hopefully prevent Eponine from murdering them in the meantime. I added some common ivy to the background as well. This plant is not native to Indonesia, but it grows readily across Europe and Western Asia. I picked it because it's extremely hardy, and it simulates the various clinging vine species found in Indonesia's tropics. I'm hoping that it will take over the background and make it into a living wall. I also planted some creeping fig on both outer corners of the tank. Ficus pumila is native across Asia, and it's another great climber, so I'm hoping it really takes over the walls of this enclosure. I also finally took the time to finish up my basking spot. I took a piece of tile and used expanding foam to attach it onto the hide, and then I covered the foam with eco-earth. I piled some cork bark and substrate up so that Eponine can easily get up here to bask. Let's take a moment to talk about my hardware and lighting. First is a PAR 38 halogen bulb I picked up from Home Depot. This is what I'm using to heat up Eponine's basking spot and hot side. I have this hooked up to a thermostat to regulate the temperature. The probe is held in place by a few slate tiles. I also have an Arcadia UVB mounted above the basking spot. It's a 22-inch tube bulb, so it stretches across a good portion of Eponine's tank. Lastly, I have an Arcadia Jungle Dawn for my plant lighting. I also have the entire build hooked up to my Mist King, which provides a steady humidity by misting my enclosure a few times throughout the day. Well, my planting is all done. You can see I added a few more plants in the center of the tank, and another hide for Eponine to choose from. Here, I'm adding leaf litter for the cleanup crew to munch on, and to really make this build feel like a tropical forest floor. I added some bigger leaves and some seed pods for more depth and texture. Now that the tank is planted, it's time to add some cleanup crew. Let's start with some isopods. I added some giant canyons first. My small culture had full-grown adults and a number of babies, so I dumped the entire thing in here, and hopefully their population will take off. I wanted a smaller species as well, and chose to add some zebra isopods to the tank. The last part of my cleanup crew were my springtails. If you're new to bioactives, the cleanup crew is essential to keep your tank free of mold and waste. Like many large reptile species, blue tongue skinks produce a lot of waste, so I'll still have to clean up after her. Finally, we can add Epi to her new home. Eponine is not usually this gray. This is just what she looks like when she's in shed. Her normal colors are much more dark brown and green, and I can't wait to show them to you after she sheds her old scales. I didn't know if I should wait to move her to her new home until afterwards, but since the shedding process can take a few weeks, I figured she would shed easier in an enclosure with a constant high humidity. Even though she's in shed, her inquisitive nature didn't change, and she spent the rest of her day exploring her new home. Well, that's all I have for you guys today. Enclosures like this take months and months to fully plan out and build, so if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, I would love it if you showed your support by subscribing to my channel. Feel free to leave any questions or comments down below, and I'll be sure to get back to you. If you're interested in a full look into what Eponine was up to for her first 24 hours in her new bioactive home, stay tuned for next week's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.